Hey, hello everyone. I maybe will just give one more minute for people to just settle down in the Zoom room. Right, okay, it's 2 past 2 now. Welcome back to our research seminar series on the topic of translanguaging, multimodality, and Chinese language education. My name is Zhang Qi from Dublin City University. There will be 2 keynote speakers sharing their latest research findings with us this afternoon. First, please allow me to introduce Dr. Caitriona Osborne, who is an assistant professor in the Irish Institute of Chinese Studies at University College Dublin. Caitriona is a committee member of the Irish Association for Applied Linguistics and the Irish Association of Chinese Teaching. She has been teaching Chinese language and Chinese teaching methodologies over the past few years. In 2023, she was awarded a UCD Teaching and Learning Award. So today, she will share with us the findings from her research project on translanguaging strategies to learn business Chinese in a content and language integrated learning classroom. So now I will give the floor to Caitriona.
Great. Thank you so much for that kind introduction, and thank you to the organizers of this event. I really enjoyed the talk earlier with Dr. Dan Ping Wong, and looking forward to the next few talks as well. So today I'm going to speak about translanguaging strategies to learn business Chinese in a CLIL classroom. And you'll see that Zhang Qi's name is also on the slide. It's a collaborative project that I'm going to present to you today. So in terms of how I'm going to talk about this topic in my slides today, first I'll give you an overview of previous studies and how the current research is framed in terms of learning strategies, moving on to translanguaging, multimodality, and trans-semiotizing, and how they relate to each other and differ from each other. And then we'll look at translanguaging strategies. A separate part to that is the notion of the CLIL classroom, so the content and language integrated learning classroom. So we'll look at why the CLIL classroom was chosen for this study. The current study then will be presented. We have some preliminary findings that we're going to present to you today, and the emphasis is on preliminary. So we welcome your feedback and any insights that come to mind, and hopefully we'll have a good discussion during the Q&A. Finally, we'll take a look at what the next steps are in this research, and look forward to hearing your thoughts on that in the Q&A. So first, we'll look at the features of the Chinese writing script. I think it's the main point that we need to start off with. We're looking at the Chinese language, which has quite a different makeup to languages from European alphabetic origin. In terms of the literacy route, we see for European alphabetic languages, the literacy route is grapheme to sound to meaning. In Chinese, however, it's grapheme to visualization to meaning. So there's something different going on with the Chinese language that we really need to consider in these studies. Of course, this concept is going to be difficult for beginner learners of Chinese and even advanced learners as they develop through their study of Chinese. So learning strategies is quite a hot topic when we want to look at what's going on with the learners. Unfortunately, the previous research, we've seen a kind of fuzziness in the definition, so no kind of clear concept coming out. And this is seen from multiple researchers in the area. The reality of strategy complexity does not equal fuzzy thinking and weak strategy definitions. So there's nothing kind of concrete coming out for us in the learning strategies. Of course, of those studies that have focused on character learning strategies, we see that there's a high reliance on the self-reporting questionnaire. We know that has certain limitations as well in terms of self-reporting. Shen, for example, and other studies have followed on from Shen, but they're also heavily reliant on each other. In terms of Oxford's taxonomy of language learning strategies, there is the repeated use of this also in terms of memory and then cognitive and metacognitive strategies. Grenfell and Harris then kind of deviate from these existing LS inventories, and they focus on thinking aloud. There's 3 types that they have found, such as focusing on the whole character, focusing on strokes, and then using prior knowledge. So what really comes about from this slide is that the translanguaging and transsemiotizing process from the visual mode of the radical to the aural mode should be considered. And there is an importance of constant reflection and autonomy we need to consider. Translanguaging, transsemiotizing, and theorizing the LS typology should be applicable across different linguistic systems. So I've spoken about this character learning strategy inventory. So let's take a look and see what some of these are. Of course, the first one, rote memorization or focused memorization, it is quite popular among Chinese as foreign language learners, which is easy to see considering that this subject has originated from China. It's probably adopting those traditional methods. Students like to handwrite, use flashcards, some note that they read aloud, they focus on the pronunciation, maybe they focus on typing, be it through pinyin input or kind of, casually tracing an outline of the character. Maybe they focus on radicals, use imagery, this kind of constant reviewing characters after class, mnemonic associations, and even the creation of idiosyncratic stories. So stories that students kind of create to help them remember the different shape of the character. So what we can see from this is that typically through the self-report research, these strategies come about. However, in terms of translanguaging will help us to see what's happening in real time. Translanguaging focuses on the process of learning rather than the output and kind of thinking back. So a little more on that later as I'll speak about the studies that have been conducted already and the one that we're working on at the moment. So why translanguaging then? So instead of treating translanguaging as a separate or closed structure, it takes on the holistic perspective to conceptualize fluidity, hybridity, and dynamics of multilingual practice. Translanguaging views the co-construction and coordination of semiotic resources in different modes as a fluid and dynamic flow of meaning making. And a key feature of translanguaging is the linguistic repertoire that a person draws from in communicative practices that are already interrelative, discursive, and cannot easily be assigned to one or another traditional definition of a language. So we can see this, as Dr. Wong mentioned many of these points earlier, but translanguaging focuses on the process, the ing, the process of meaning making. Of course, as it comes in research, it's not without critics. So Pennycook would say there's nothing new in translanguaging that we already know, but it's a useful tool for the learner strategy research, which is what we are focusing on. It concentrates on the language learning process rather than the static entity of languages or the product, I suppose. It focuses on that process of meaning making. Again, another keyword from today's talk earlier on, it utilizes the decolonizing potential of translanguaging to challenge the hegemonic language ideologies embedded in linguistic racism, such as foreign language learning, including Chinese, conforming to and being normalized with English. So this point really spoke to me also when Dr. Wong mentioned this earlier, the kind of concept that anything other than Western should be wrong, for example. So we kind of challenge that and we take a look at the learning strategies in this way through a different lens. Learning the Chinese script then suggests a process of in between and going beyond different modalities in terms of trans-semiotizing. So I'm conscious that there's a lot of wordy phrases here. So I'm going to take a look a little bit more closely at translanguaging and trans-semiotizing. So translanguaging refers to this trans-semiotic system that can activate a person's semiotic repertoire, which primarily consists of linguistic signs as well as other modes of meaning-making signs. So meaning-making here. Meaning making can be achieved through science in any form or mode, and the combination of different semiotic resources exists in all human communicative acts that we can think of. Monolingual speakers can also practice translanguaging despite having a smaller semiotic repertoire than that of multilinguals, which makes sense because if different meaning making can be achieved through science in any form or mode, this is easy to see how it can happen. Successful multilingual interactions have always been aided by multimodalities, including gestures, objects, visual cues, touch, tone, sounds, and other modes of communication besides words. So again, taking the words out of it, monolinguals also can practice in this translanguaging process, which we can see. There is some kind of overlap between translanguaging and multimodality. So in my next slide now, I'm going to kind of show the difference between the two. So translanguaging as a process, again, we think of this as something continuous, ing. So the first use of translanguaging, of course, we probably all know this now, in the Welsh classroom, and this depicted the language alternation in the learning process. So in Wales, the medium of instruction would be primarily Welsh, and then the students or the children in the classes were going home to speak English. So in the classroom, the students were drawing on their own linguistic repertoire to create meaning and help each other to create meaning in the process of learning. The languaging part embedded in the translanguaging theory, that refers to the process of using language to gain knowledge, to make sense, and to articulate one's thought and to communicate about using language. So the process of using language to make meaning. In terms of multimodality, the focus is on poly or multi. So the core of multimodality seems to be the emphasis on the poly aspect of languages, or the existence of multiple modes of signs. So take a little break from this kind of heavy definition, and we'll look at the road to the current research and kind of what led us to this point. So we saw that there is the need for more research to be published on the learner strategies, and it's also been reported in the research that this needs to happen. And then kind of interlinked with that, there is the reliance on the second language acquisition theories as well. So not really taking into consideration the unique characteristics of the Chinese language, which would be useful for us to learn about. So we have previously published a paper, and Dr. Wong kindly mentioned us earlier today. And this paper is a think-aloud method of investigating translanguaging strategies in learning Chinese characters. So this study was conducted by myself and Zhang Qi and our other colleague in Bath University. So we used the think-aloud method for this study, and it was employed to investigate the translanguaging strategies of CFL learners. Remember, the LS inventory, the learning strategy inventory, has been highly reliant on the kind of self-report questionnaire and what students are reporting to do. But through a think-aloud activity, this could actually allow us to see the process of meaning making, the process of the students learning the characters and how they came about. So in terms of this study, there was 5 think aloud activities involved, plus weekly quizzes. The 2 female and 2 male participants were aged about 19 or 20. So you can see from the table, the picture there, that they conducted over 5 weeks the number of new characters they learned per week, so 21, 20, 33, and so on. The number of characters, though, that they learned in terms of the Think Aloud exercise was 5, and the number of characters for the quiz then that they had to learn was those 5 as well. So they had the incentive to learn through the Think Aloud because they were also going to be tested on these characters, which is what they knew about. So from this, a new typology was developed, and we're going to take a look at some of the translanguaging strategies that came about. And this is the really fascinating part of the research. So if I start from the left side of the screen, we look at the coding name. So the first one is a link to motion. So the brief explanation beside it. So in the composition of a character, students would associate a stroke with emotion, such as down, across, like up, So we can really follow the pattern of what they're writing on the page. So they were to write out the character 10 times and, talk about what they were doing as they were writing out the characters. So we can see in this link to motion, they're really following the line of where their hand is moving or the pen is moving on the paper. Remember, this is handwriting. The next one is the link to animated motion, and it's a subcategory of the link to motion. So this animated motion, let's have a look. In the composition of a character, strokes are associated with an animated motion, such as a kick, a flick, or kicking legs. So we imagine something in motion, yeah, something animated. It's flicking, it's kicking, for example. The second then coding name we can see is this link to other objects. So the shape or form of a character is associated with objects other than a Chinese character, such as a skirt, a bridge, or even a fork. So the shape of everyday objects, we can see that the students are relating the characters to. Sometimes, they wouldn't even have anything to do with the meaning, but it's just something that the students are reminded of when they're writing these characters. A subsection of a subcategory of the other objects is the link to body parts. So the shape or form of a character is associated with the body parts of a human or an animal, such as legs or eyes or bunny ears or even a smile. So we can imagine any kind of curved is like a smile, for example. The bunny ears, we can almost picture it as well. The third one then was the linking to other characters that they had previously learned. So it reminds them of other characters, maybe with a similar shape, or maybe it shares similar parts. So for example, the right-hand part of this Chinese character for bottle ping is linked with Wu, the character for number 5. So this is a direct quote taken from the transcription that we found. So the first character I'm writing is ping. So first there's almost like a little curve at the top, but straight down, and the gaps when they're writing. Then the next part looks almost like Wu. So they're being reminded of what the character looks like. The final category, number 4, then, is linked to Roman alphabet shape. So again, it's linking to something that they are familiar with, but this time in terms of letters. So the shape or form is associated with this letter that may have a similar shape, or, it's perceived as a similar shape, at least to the students. So for example, the outside radical of song is linked to the letter L. So they kind of call this the fancy L with a little flick. Yeah. So when we're writing in, as in a secondary school setting, I grew up in Ireland, so I'm well used to this, or in a primary school setting, we used to learn kind of cursive writing. So this would be quite a fancy L that they're describing. So it kind of made sense to me that they mirror that image. So from these different examples, from the coding of the data, we identified 3 types of translanguaging strategy when these students were learning Chinese. And they are to do with embodiment, translanguaging resemblance, and hybrid. So the coding strategies that I just mentioned through one by one are linked here on this table. So in terms of embodiment, we have the link to motion and link to other objects. So what the characters embody. The second, in the kind of orange highlight, we have the translanguaging resemblance. And this is linking to characters that they know, or maybe the letters that they know in their familiar alphabet. So it's really, again, drawing on their linguistic repertoire to make meaning. And finally, the hybrid we can see in terms of creating a narrative for different character types. So from this paper, we have a working definition for translanguaging strategies. So the LS, the learner strategy, therefore demonstrates translanguaging, especially transsemiotizing features, when being employed in the process of learning Chinese characters. So we can really see the students drawing on their full linguistic repertoire when they are learning Chinese characters, when they're handwriting them in isolation. So moving on from this study, in terms of typing Chinese characters, we're moving on a little bit from handwriting. Typing, of course, is a huge topic and a hugely debated topic in this area at the moment, especially since COVID. I know we're sick of saying it, but it is true. It's raised a lot of questions in terms of teaching and learning Chinese, and really how to manage this kind of teaching and learning online. On a very high level, the typing exhibits a significant positive effect on phonology recognition and phoneme-morpheme mapping. Typing does not, however, encourage learning whole character representation, which is the main concern when applying typing in CFL learning. So we need to take that into consideration. We're currently working on a paper that will look at the typing strategies for Chinese characters. So keep an eye out for that, and please keep in touch if you want to be sent a link to that. The current research then, finally, we're moving on to the current research based on kind of all our knowledge of the previous, what was in the field, and then our own kind of investigation of what's going on. So the current, the main research points that we want to look at. So what learning strategies do CFL learners use when typing a business Chinese text? So when they're typing a text now, moving away from characters in isolation, we want to look at this kind of whole text in terms of meaning making. How do they differ from strategies used when typing characters or handwriting characters in isolation? So the previous study that I mentioned, that was our study on handwriting characters in isolation, and our typing characters study is forthcoming. We've conducted a microanalysis of translanguaging strategies that are used to assist students learning in a CLIL classroom, remember, content language integrated learning. And it draws concepts from embodied cognition to use translanguaging as a parameter to categorize LS for Chinese. So that will challenge these kind of hegemonic language ideologies, such as Chinese being conformed to the English or being normalized with English, as Dr. Wong mentioned again, you know, anything outside the kind of Western ideology. So we hope to address that. So in brief terms, CLIL is the content and language integrated learning. So in the CLIL situation, the target language is used as the medium to teach content. So learning content through the target language. The target language then becomes the medium of knowledge transfer. Communicative teaching approach plus task-based learning is really the marriage of those two, communicative teaching and task-based. So being able to carry out a task and focusing on the communicative approach. Of course, when we think about this, it's definitely more suitable for non-beginner classes. Beginner class is not suited because if you're coming in with the medium of instruction straight away as the target language, students might be lost. So it's definitely more suitable for non-beginner classes. So why did we look at CLIL? Why is this necessary? Well, CLIL can actually help us to uncover the translanguaging strategies and the specific language use in the meaning-making activity. So we can uncover what strategies students are using and what different languages they're using to create this meaning in creating a business text. It's not only focused on the L2 output, it's not only focused on the text, what they can deliver, but the entire process of them creating the text. And again, as I'll mention in a couple of slides, we adopt the think-aloud method. This has been very useful for us in our research. Translanguaging in the context of CLIL has been somewhat reported on. So the first quote we see from Nakula and Moore in 2016, it would be helpful for teachers to have an overall understanding of translanguaging, not only as a pedagogic strategy to support learning, but also as a feature of natural bilingual discourse, which they and their students can employ according to the situational demands. So kind of a more kind of natural approach to this. The second one, translanguaging should not be reduced to simply a scaffolding strategy, as emphasized in much of the literature. Rather, it is a crucial language theory that underpins our understanding of meaning-making and pedagogical practices. So these kind of keywords of meaning-making and process really come to the fore. There's much debate on teacher attitudes towards translanguaging in the foreign language classroom, such as those who are more prone or maybe feel it's more, and I put it in quote, right to speak in the monolingual approach, they feel they're kind of veering away from, you know, teaching the language if they don't stick to this monolingual approach, which has been highly advocated. And so there is this kind of almost reluctance to use other languages in the classroom. So we definitely need to see what's going on there. Finally, to the meaty part of the presentation and the current research project about the CLIL classroom. So looking in the blue box, what the data collection consisted of. Firstly, we prescribed 2 think-aloud activities. So the 2 activities, students were asked to describe a typical business-related scene or image and record their thoughts aloud while doing so. So on the right-hand side of the screen, these are the instructions that were given to students. Of course, we held a kind of training session for them that I was involved in, and I was able to explain to them exactly what the think aloud method was, how it's useful for us, and how they should approach the topic. So the study asks that participants employ the think aloud method when typing both paragraphs. In a nutshell, the think aloud method involves verbally articulating your thoughts and commentary when carrying out each task. So the following bullet points were really given to them as a refresher, and they had more kind of in-depth training in the classroom. So you should begin the audio recording as soon as you begin the task. The purpose is to record what you are thinking and doing as you carry out the task. I gave them some prompts, you know, what the picture reminds them of. So they're going to type about this, for example. They should verbalize their entire thought process, from what you would like to write to how you are typing each character, basically encouraging them to speak aloud as much as possible, to give us as much detail as possible. They can describe anything that comes to mind when typing, such as the character sound, shape, meaning, any other related topics. And this in particular was kind of, I suppose, inspired by our previous research of students who were able to relate the different character shapes to maybe objects or other letters, other characters that they were familiar with. So 8 participants, back to the blue box now, the second point, 8 participants were recruited at the advanced level. So these were stage 4 students in a university. They submitted 12 audio recordings in total, which was approximately 130 minutes of data that we collected. Instructions were given prior to the first exercise, like the think aloud, how to conduct that, also consent forms, the information sheet, the timeline, and even information on typing. As Dr. Wang mentioned earlier today, it's really important that we don't assume that students or younger people are, you know, these kind of technology whiz, I suppose, that they know exactly what to do. We do need to be conscious to explain exactly how to carry out each technological task that we're asking of them. So that was really important for us too. In terms of the business Chinese module and what that involved, so it's a stage 4 module. So the module is aimed to further enhance students' spoken and written language skills in a business context and to promote their awareness about the business environment and culture in contemporary China. So this module was really set up for business Chinese students. Of course, it's open to all, as some can take it as elective, but really it is focusing on those who are majoring in business studies. Students needed to have prior knowledge, which was equivalent to the HSK level 4. So again, the CLIL classroom, it's, you know, not necessarily suitable for the beginner learners. So this HSK level 4 is more appropriate. At the end of the course, students should be able to, so their learning outcomes were to access business news and articles in Chinese on extensive topics, demonstrate a deepened understanding of business environment in contemporary China, gain vocabulary and fluency in Chinese to function in a business context, such as business negotiation, and demonstrate presentation skills on business topics supported by charts and data. So throughout the module, students will be looking at different case studies of businesses in China, maybe businesses setting up in China, the different kind of market shares that are happening there. As part of the assessment, then they could do a written exam in terms of, you know, continuous assessment, but also they might do a practical as well, such as doing a mock interview. after submitting a Chinese CV. So students will do a mock business interview. So it's really preparing them for the business world, which is why the CLIL classroom is so appropriate for this module. So the data collection, what did we actually gather here? So the blue box on the left-hand side, the tap is think aloud practice, so think aloud. So the first one, it asks students to describe the location and interior design of Dunnes Stores. So Dunnes Stores is a local supermarket. There's well, local, you can have them all over Ireland, and it's quite a popular store. It's Irish owned, and there's, you know, it's quite popular one over here. So within that, students were asked to describe the location, the interior, and they were given some vocabulary to assist them. So they were given some prompts, as well as the pictures. For the tap 2, they were asked to describe the market share. So that's the second picture that you see on the right-hand side, just underneath. So describe the market share and the increasing speed of the first brand. And so in terms of the completed work and the audio received, 8 participants submitted the first tap and 4 participants the second one. So although this wasn't necessarily graded, the students were told that they would get some good feedback, which would help them for their final exam. So some students were quite eager to submit and get feedback, but we can see that some of the participation kind of wavered a bit in the second one. Still, we have over 130 minutes of data gathered, so it's still quite rich, the data, which we were delighted to see. So in terms of the data collection, all the audio was transcribed by one researcher and then checked by another. After this, we conducted some thematic analysis, and we looked at 3 types of embodiment among this independent coding. So in terms of the preliminary findings of the codings, we can see these 4 main kind of streams that are coming about. So the first one looks at planning. So the students talking about the different ways that they're going to plan their assignment. Self-reflection comes about quite a bit, which makes sense because the students are, you know, speaking aloud their thoughts, exactly what's going through their mind. So we could really see that this self-reflection is quite obvious here. They also look at some typing strategies. So maybe we'll look at some examples later on, but maybe to do with typing a character in that very moment, or maybe how they're you know, going to phrase something. Vocabulary check as well. It was a really interesting one to see. So students, you know, are kind of pausing in the middle of their assessment to check some vocabulary. Oh, is that right? Did I think that was right? Why did I think that? You know, you can hear them thinking in terms of vocabulary. So they wanted to make sure that they were on the right track with that. And so that caused a little bit of kind of a break of flow, I suppose, in the meaning making process. Because they wanted to just check the vocabulary, make sure that everything was correct. So we'll look at these in a little bit more detail. So as I mentioned, the data collection is ongoing. So these are the preliminary nodes or preliminary findings that we have here. So we used NVivo for this to consolidate the findings and to make the codings. In terms of planning, we can see that planning the format and planning what to type came to the fore. So planning the format was really talking about how the students are going to organize their assignment. Okay, first I'll say this, then I'll say that. And students used English, Chinese and English, and Chinese. So they differed. So different, you know, some students used mainly just Chinese for the entire task. Maybe they just use English for the entire task, but a lot of them are using a kind of a mix of Chinese and English, which is interesting to see. You can see on the very right-hand side of the screen of the references, how many references we found. So you can see the popularity of each of them. In terms of planning what to type, remember in the first picture, students were given some kind of set phrases that would help them along the way. So planning what to type in terms of Chinese, we can see it's increasing a bit, but Chinese and English, using both languages is strong again in this instance. And then finally, using English. Self-reflection, again, is students kind of pausing and reflecting on what they're typing, what they're writing, their certain situation. The typing strategies, then we can see haptic embodiment, imagined embodiment, and reflective embodiment as well coming to the fore. Again, the vocabulary check, that interesting one, 34 references. And again, just to emphasize, these are preliminary and we're still working through the data. It's quite a lot, as you can imagine. The examples, I think it's quite useful to see what we're talking about in terms of examples. Just to also, for those not in Dublin, especially not on the south side, you might not know that Cornell's Court is a location on the south side, and Dunnes Stores as well is that shop. So in terms of planning, when using just Chinese, so the students would say, okay, in the picture, I can see Dunnes Stores, it's in Cornell's Court. Okay, so we're using the Chinese language to describe what's in the picture. For the English, we had quite a chatty student. She said, right, okay, I think that more or less covers everything I've done. I've talked about the location, talked about the size of the shop, to the coffee shop, the different clothes section, and he gave a great detail on how he was planning how he's planning the assignment. Then in terms of the mix, and this is quite I suppose, a telling, a really obvious example here. I'm just thinking of what items to include and the Chinese words for them, basic things such as bread, bao, milk, nyonai, and so on. So he was listing these items. So he was trying, I suppose, trying to include as much Chinese as possible when he was completing his assignment. Then in terms of planning the sentences at the sentence level, so 这是 Dunnes 的商店 and so on. So this is Dunnes Stores, and then they're talking about how famous it is. It's a famous Irish store, for example. In English, then you can see, so my first sentence would probably be something about how good Dunnes Stores is as a company in Ireland and in the community, and so on. And then there's a mix that we can see. So 登记有很多商店. No, that's not correct. Okay, so go back, they're talking to themselves and kind of rectifying that. So they're planning at the sentence level. So they're trying to figure out how to say what they want from English into Chinese. We could really see that happening in the planning stage. Moving on then to self-reflection, and I'll come back to the self-reflection at the end. But one of the kind of prime examples is encapsulated here. This might be actually like super bad grammar, so I'm very sorry if that's the case. So they're kind of commenting and being critical of their performance a little bit, talking about how they're doing, oh, I used to know that character, now I don't, for example. So they're being quite critical and reflecting on their process overall. The typing strategies, again, were very interesting. So we can see kind of some frustrations creeping in with the typing. Again, we presume that students love to deal with technology and they're experts in it. But actually, we can see some frustrations here. The first one in particular, what's happening? Yeah, so that's students, what's happening? No, can you just and then they realize the mistake that they made. So for sure, they wrote S-H-E rather than S-H-I. The second one, I always get 便宜 wrong. 便宜, like gung, but without the stroke. So she's thinking, yes, I usually get that one wrong, and I must remember that it's the different pattern here I need to remember. No, that's 一家. Yeah, that's a family. I want 一家 as in IKEA. Okay, this one. Yeah, so they've picked it out. So because of the similar sounds in Chinese, and because they have to pick out when they're typing, they have to pick out the correct and be able to recognize the correct character. So sometimes that can be a little bit frustrating. It's not exactly the character combination that they want or that they need, but it keeps coming up for them. So that can cause a kind of pause as well in the typing process and causing them to kind of reflect on that. It's 照片 photo? I hope it is. Let me just Google that. Why do I feel like it is? Oh, yes, it is. Yeah, so that's a kind of a typical vocabulary check example. Let me just check that. I'll just Google that. I'll just use my phone to check that and so on. So let me just Google that. Oh, yes, it is. They can see it is. So we'll just move on to some of the limitations before I wrap up. So a limitation of the think-aloud protocol is speaking about what students had done rather than what they were doing in the moment. So this came up a little bit in the research. They weren't necessarily carrying out the think-aloud protocol correctly. So they perceived the TAP activities as a conversation with their instructor, maybe, rather than speaking out loud their thoughts. And so they almost felt, it sounded to us like they were almost being judged on their performance when it wasn't the case at all. So they'd say, oh, I'm really sorry, or I just didn't have time to do enough this week. I'm sorry, it's so rushed. I didn't mean this, blah, blah, blah. So they think of it as a conversation with their instructors rather than just kind of freely thinking aloud their thoughts. The second one, probably the most frustrating one, is that when participants were typing, they remained silent. But actually we can hear the keys clicking, we can hear them typing. We're unclear what's going on in their mind, or if they're just kind of, they had thought about it before and are just typing freely. We actually don't know what's going on there, but frustrating that we can hear the typing and we can hear the pauses throughout. Number 3, then, when they had an issue when typing out a character or sentence and tried to figure out how to tackle it, they just remained silent. So I suppose this can be a limitation of TAP in general. When you're trying to think something through, the students kind of remained quiet rather than verbalizing their thoughts. It's probably easier to kind of sit back and remain a little bit silent rather than try and articulate it. So it's almost certain that there should be something going through their mind in this case, but the participants didn't articulate their thoughts, so we don't really know what's going on in that moment. So there are the findings are quite rich that we can see, and we're working through them. There are some limitations to be mindful of. In terms of ironing out in the preliminary findings, so our next task, those self-reflection examples that I spoke about in terms of embodied reflection. We need to figure out, is this reactive commentary to what's happening on the screen? So that student who was frustrated with the character popping up, oh no, why did you do that? Why is it not doing this way? Is it just reactive, or is it a strategy? Because a strategy is this mentally guided action. So is it mentally guided, or is it a seemingly unrelated thought? Is it one of these kind of reactive comments to a frustration that they feel? There's also, we can see some overlapping of categories, particularly in the context of reflections. So is the student reflecting on the task at hand, or are they reacting to maybe a technological mishap, reacting to their performance? Say, oh, I used to be able to write this character and now I can't remember, for example. So we need to figure out this kind of overlapping of categories and iron them out a little bit more. So the next steps then is to complete this thorough analysis and kind of fine-tune these findings and further refine the typology. So going back through the examples that we've seen and really make sure that they're clear-cut, that there's no overlapping of categories, that the self-reflection is truly self-reflection, and how we can present that in the findings. So that's all for me. I'm conscious of the time, and I know that there's another speaker after me, so I am conscious of the time. But thank you all for coming today, for listening. Welcome any comments or questions that you have for the Q&A now. And as always, if you would like further information on our studies, you can get in contact with my email there. Feel free to take note of the email, or Zhang Qi's email as well is there too. So thank you all for listening. I appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Caitriona, for such an interesting talk. That's great time management, which allows us to have some questions and answers, or even just comments. Please feel free to raise your hand, and then we can and then unmute yourself to ask questions or just give comments. Or if you feel more comfortable, please leave your questions or comments in the chat box. just gave our participants like a minute to think about, to reflect, to do some self-reflection so that they can come up with either